By the late 19th century, the British Empire had learned a hard lesson. Direct rule alone was not enough to control vast populations. Power could not rely only on armies, laws, or administrators. After the shock of 1857, Britain understood that unity among the ruled was the greatest threat to empire. From that realization emerged one of the most effective and enduring strategies of imperial control: divide and rule. This approach was not invented in India, but nowhere was it refined more carefully. The British Crown now ruled India openly, yet it ruled with caution. Every decision was shaped by fear of another uprising. Officials asked one central question again and again: how do you govern millions without provoking unity against you? The answer was separation. Indian society was already complex, layered with religion, caste, language, and region. The British did not create these differences, but they learned how to use them. What had once been fluid identities became fixed categories under imperial administration. Communities that had lived side by side for centuries were increasingly described as separate, distinct, and incompatible. The British state began to define people through classification. Census records demanded clear labels. Religion was recorded rigidly. Caste was formalized into permanent hierarchies. What had once been social realities became political identities. Difference was no longer just cultural. It became administrative. This process served a clear purpose. A population that sees itself as divided is less likely to unite. A community that competes with another for recognition or favor is less likely to challenge authority above them. Representation followed the same logic. Limited political participation was introduced, but carefully structured to prevent collective action. Separate electorates were created. Different communities voted separately. Political interests were framed as conflicting rather than shared. Instead of a single national voice, Britain encouraged many smaller voices that could be managed, negotiated with, or ignored. At the local level, the same strategy applied. Princes were preserved where useful. Landlords were empowered where cooperative. Traditional elites were protected if they supported imperial rule. Authority flowed downward through intermediaries, creating layers of dependency. Loyalty to the empire was rewarded. Dissent was isolated. Religion became a particularly sensitive tool. British officials presented themselves as neutral arbiters between religious communities, even as their policies deepened divisions. Laws were written differently for different groups. Legal customs were separated. Religious identity became tied to political representation. Over time, communities began to see the state not as distant, but as something that favored one group over another. Suspicion grew sideways instead of upward. Tension moved horizontally across society rather than vertically toward authority. Language policy reinforced the same pattern. Administrative boundaries were drawn along linguistic lines. Education systems emphasized difference. Even geography was reorganized in ways that hardened identity. Maps created borders that people had never previously recognized. The genius of divide and rule was that it appeared passive. Britain could claim it was merely managing diversity. In reality, it was shaping it. This strategy extended beyond India. Across the empire, similar patterns emerged. In Africa, artificial borders grouped rival communities together while splitting others apart. In the Middle East, lines were drawn with little regard for history. In settler colonies, indigenous populations were separated, categorized, and marginalized through law. But in India, the consequences were especially deep. As political awareness grew among Indians, it grew unevenly. Instead of a single movement, multiple movements emerged, each shaped by the identities the empire had reinforced. Political debate increasingly focused on representation between communities rather than collective freedom. British administrators encouraged this framing, positioning themselves as necessary moderators. This system allowed Britain to rule with relatively small numbers. It reduced the need for constant military force. Order was maintained not just through power, but through managed tension. Yet divide and rule carried long-term risks. By institutionalizing difference, the British transformed social boundaries into political fault lines. What had once been negotiable became fixed. What had once been local became national. Identity hardened. Suspicion deepened. British officials believed this was stability. In reality, it was postponed conflict. As decades passed, the empire found itself increasingly trapped by its own strategy. Any attempt to loosen control risked unleashing tensions it had helped create. Any attempt to reform representation threatened to upset the delicate balance it had designed. The irony was clear. Divide and rule kept the empire safe in the short term, but fragile in the long term. By the early 20th century, Indian political movements were becoming more organized, more vocal, and more aware of imperial manipulation. Some leaders began to recognize that division itself was a tool of control. Calls for unity grew, even as structural barriers made unity difficult. The British Empire had mastered governance through separation. It had turned difference into defense. But in doing so, it had reshaped society in ways that would outlast empire itself. When independence eventually came, it would not arrive into a neutral landscape. It would arrive into a world shaped by decades of deliberate division. Borders would matter. Identities would matter. Conflicts would matter. Divide and rule was one of the most powerful weapons of the British Empire. It required no battlefield. It left few visible scars at first, but its impact would echo long after the empire retreated. As the 20th century approached, Britain believed it had perfected control. Yet beneath the surface, new forms of resistance were forming, not always against each other, but increasingly against the system that kept them apart. In the next chapter, the empire will present itself as a builder of progress. Railways, roads, and telegraphs will spread across the land. Britain will claim it is modernizing India. But behind that progress will lie the same question that shaped everything before. Who truly benefits from empire?